Hi, everybody. I'm Layman Pascal. I'll be your moderator, not because I want to, but because it counts as community service if you've been arrested for giving ketamine to ducks outside yoga conferences. I'm not proud of that behavior, but in my defense, I thought I was helping. And thinking you're helping is a good segue into iatrogenic soteriology. Soteriology studies salvation, saviors, the urge to save others, the idea of saving the world and making it a better place. Iatrogenics is the study of the harm done by healers and helpers. We've all been interfered with by someone who thought they were helping. And even my hero, the Greek-Japanese Zen master Hakuin, tells a cautionary tale about the time he used the edge of his thumbnail to help a butterfly struggling to get free of its cocoon. And afterwards, that little butterfly had a tiny transparent injury in just that spot, and it could never fly correctly. The iatrogenic soteriology. So here we are together at this Consilience conference, trying to cultivate a wisdom commons, trying to address the meta crisis, trying to mobilize a unified psychology, trying to bring well-being and depth and enlightenment to the world through transdisciplinary meta logic and meta community. Why wouldn't this attempt of ours to help not also cause all kinds of problems? If doctors and hospitals are a leading cause of sickness and death, then why wouldn't there be ways in which we ourselves are causing harm through our aspirations? When does the very approach we're using constitute a blind spot that obscures our own role in perpetuating the very problems we're purporting to be solving? The stakes are high: meaning crisis, youth mental health crisis, overlapping ecological crises, global economic cul-de-sac, insufficient educational systems, the list goes on. Our communities are very happy to critique the underlying generator functions in Game A and modernity that expose their method of problem solving as being the problem itself. But do we have the curiosity and the feeling capacity and the insight to inspect ourselves in this same manner? So today we're going to explore this inquiry from several angles, leaving open lots of space for emergence and hopefully for our speakers to say a few novel things they might not have said before. We'll have Tom Murray speak to the problems inherent in the unidirectional development of complex models and complex cognition. What are the traps in the ascensionist paradigm of growing and building and achieving and escaping and transforming? Where does that sentiment become an issue? And how do we sanely trade off between development and release of our sophisticated approaches? And what might the role of affective and interpersonal intelligence be in enabling appropriate release? Then Mr. Steve March will explore the threshold at which our strategies and models and tactics cease to be a helpful introduction to real healing and risk becoming a distortion or impediment to further, deeper, and truly transformational interactions. How do we stay focused on skills of functional intimacy rather than getting trapped in the insularity of meta theory and meta discourse? And finally, Bonnitta Roy will dazzle us with a free-form jazz solo entitled Performative Contradiction No. 7. Or else maybe she will explore some serious issues related to how we tailor an ecology of practices toward the kinds of body minds that we are today. If we don't deeply understand the subjects of today's distress, and if we lack the correct vision of a new human, then our soteriological attempts will almost certainly become iatrogenic. Each person will speak for about 5 to 15 minutes. Depending on duration, I might ask a follow-up question. So then that's about 45. We'll move into an open discussion between the presenters and possibly myself for another 15. And around the 1 hour mark, we'll open it wide up for question and answers and interactivity. So keep your third ear open as we go for whatever questions or additions might be bubbling around at the tip of your mental tongues. Put them in the Q&A or save them to share later. Either way is good. And depending on how we feel, we might keep this room open past the official timeline. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, I give you my friend, the illustrious human-alien hybrid, Tom Murray.
Awesome. I've never been introduced that way before, Layman. And your summary of my presentation is as good as the presentation itself, which is not surprising to me. So, yeah, I'm going to kick it off here with a more theoretical orientation, and then Steve and Bonnie will speak more to kind of practical applications of some of the things that we have in common. I hope my theoretical orientation will serve somewhat of a foundation or feed into what they are talking about. I'm going to talk about ascending versus descending paths in our search for wisdom and consilience. My background is in ego development, in adult developmental theories. And today I'm going to be drawing from a paper titled Wisdom, Complexity, and Transcendence, a Developmental Frame, which is going to be in the Oxford Handbook of Adult Development and Wisdom, coming out hopefully later this year. Just starting to frame like what is consilience for me in the context of this presentation. It's a collective knowledge building effort where we're trying to support some kind of change or transformation or wisdom to address the meta crisis. And the core idea behind consilience is that there's a convergence that's possible of both theoretical truths and diverse perspectives and data. They can all come together into some kind of a unity of knowledge if we work at it, which presupposes a kind of unity of the underlying reality. So I'm going to, so my expertise, as I said, is in adult development and ego development, and which is about the individual, but I'm going to take some themes from that, try to apply them to this more collective knowledge building effort. So ego development is the study of the development of meaning-making complexity or perspective taking, or the sense of the self as it can develop beyond the sort of classical Piagetian childhood stages that were studied back then. There's a lot of different theories and different models in this space. And what I'm going to talk about today in terms of ascending and descending movements applies to any or all of those. I orient to the stages model, Terry O'Fallon's stages model, but there are many out there. What I'm trying to do here is link these models, many of which tend to focus on the ascending path, and they speak to the descending path, which is things like shadow work. But the ascending movement is well formalized in various theories. The descending path is spoken to, but not very well formalized. So my project is about trying to look at underlying foundational aspects of psychological growth and trying to tie those two together, in a sense, tying this realm more closely to things like trauma theory. When we talk about consilience, there's a number of conundrums or controversies that naturally come up. And these have been addressed in other panels. I'll just point to them. One is whether reality is fundamentally of a unity or of a plurality. So the question is, can our cognitive apparatus actually move towards a way of perceiving reality together in a way that moves towards a kind of unity of perspectives, or is reality fundamentally different than that, so that project is flawed from the start? Second question is, if that project is doable in terms of this convergence towards some kind of model of reality or knowledge, wisdom, when does that convergence lead to a kind of hegemony or groupthink? So that's another important question in this community. I'm going to be focusing on a third question, which is, when is the metaphor of growing or building or transcending the wrong move? And when is it that it's better to think of this project in terms of releasing complexity or unlearning? So to kind of anticipate the punchline at the end, can this project of building theories and building models, taking ever more perspectives, can that be supplemented by a project that looks more like moving towards a consilience of unknowing, or consilience of being, or emptiness, or freedom, or something like that? I think that the two of them need to work together side by side. And that downward direction has been, it is already part of our conversation, and my work is just trying to formalize that a little bit so we can have the conversation. So I associate ego development very closely with wisdom and wisdom skill. I think it's one of the best, the research and the assessments in this area are some of the best psychometric tools and models that have a large Venn diagram overlap with what we might think of as wisdom skill. There's a lot of different theories of what wisdom is, but I think this is a pretty good match. So I often will equate the two. So both wisdom and ego development require both the ascending and the descending movements to be happening. So part of our concept of wisdom involves humility. So there's skillfulness, there's humility, there's learning, there's unlearning, there's knowing and unknowing, building complexity, releasing complexity. So these two kinds of movements are part and parcel of how we think of wisdom. But as I said, the descending movements are spoken to, but not as well formalized as the ascending. So I am going to share my screen here for just a couple of slides. All right. Can you all see that? It's nodding. Good. So it's a visualization of the model. So we have this formula that if you're going to talk about wisdom or ego development, you need these two parts, and they're both equally important. And I call them complexity, capacity, and spiritual clarity. Complexity capacity points towards ever more divergence, diversity, uniqueness. Spiritual clarity points more towards the ever-present origin of further and further what things have in common. So on the ascending side, we have notions of learning, it's additive, evolution, development. And on the descending side, we have these notions of release, healing, unlearning, release of structures that are there that then allow for a resurgence of insight and new understanding to birth out of that. And the relationship between these two sides is part of what I'm working out. I won't have much time to get into that now, but basically the model of development is one of volume. We've got altitude and depth working together. And again, trying to integrate some of what's being learned in trauma theory into adult development. So you can add this to adult development in any of the theories that have different layers. So this is combining this idea with the levels notion that we, as it's worked out in many theories of cognitive development and other kinds of development. And we can make the presupposition that different layers of the stack are deconstructed or released with different kinds of psychotechnologies, with contemplative practice, deconstructing things at the core self, things like this, your basic sense of ego, but even things like time and space, object permanence. Those are what a lot of, especially the more intense contemplative practices are looking at. We have psychotherapy, we have philosophy and dialogos. So again, it's about this movement between the descending and the ascending processes. And that's the only slide I'm going to share. Okay. So why is this important? Because most of our suffering, I would say, is not because we're not thinking in complex enough ways. It's because of the intergenerational trauma that we have in our systems and in our cultures. And the important process is the process of cleaning up, the process of releasing, deconstructing. even though we have a common narrative in our community that the world is an increasingly complex and fast-changing place, and VUCA and all of that, and so we need to build more complex thinkers, I'm saying that at least half, and probably more than half, of the actual work has to do with the descending directions. So I want to say a little bit about the foundations, the kind of more theoretical foundations of how this ascending and descending movements can be tied together. We have a concept in our community that's pretty pervasive, that what we're about is about transcending and including, and that development and evolution are about transcending and including. And I would propose that it's more about transcending and excluding, and even transcending is a problematic concept, but it's basically about things. The way that development and evolution tend to work is things build upon other structures, but while they do, as they do that, they occlude things along the way. So in other words, all cognitive structures, and this idea is, I would say, true for all structures in reality, but we're just applying it here to the mind and the mind-body, to human structures. So all structures, learning, development, meaning-making, they create a kind of a structure in the mind system, and in order to be a stable base for other things to build upon, they have to be stable, those connections. They have to resist challenge. And so in the process of creating these stable structures, there are things underneath that are hidden, or potentials or capacities that are then occluded. So just in the sense that all solutions create new problems, we don't know, and we actually can't know at the time these occlusions are created what the actual problem is. So all of these occlusions eventually called to be seen through or healed or released at some point. So we need a constant kind of cycling between the growth and the release processes to reach, what we would call wisdom. And that's so the usual growth processes are actually transcend and exclude. And the release, I also use the word ablation. So we want to release or ablate those occlusions. So just to give some, maybe obvious examples, as we grow, as we develop, I mean, it's obvious that we leave certain things behind. Our imaginal thinking, the sense of enchantment on wonder with the world, connection with nature, the simple joys of living. We can get sophisticated in ways that we lose our trust or intimacy with others. We can get modern and lose our respect for convention, loyalty, solidarity. These are kind of general socially common kinds of things, but of course, all of us also in our own psychological growth have these shadow structures that get built. I want to look particularly, there are many different processes that I look at in my paper in terms of what are the psychological, what are the sub-processes of development. And I kind of break that down in different ways and show how every one of them produces these occlusions, this shadow material by necessity. But let's just look at one of them, which is the process of abstraction, which is very pertinent to our projects of creating theories and general principles together, as an example of this dynamic. So an abstraction is, you take different objects and you notice something that's in common about them, you create a higher level object, and you ignore the things that are not important. You ignore the differences that are not important. And that creates a very powerful cognitive tool, and that can go abstraction upon abstraction upon abstraction. But who is to say what is important? So you've just thrown out a bunch of stuff as unimportant in any abstraction. And so there's a built-in bias into every move into abstraction. And so that's just one example of how we're always occluding or leaving something behind in these processes of development, as they're understood in terms of differentiation and integration, all these movements of splitting and joining. all those ascending moves don't actually recover, in the theories that we have, they don't recover what's left behind. So we need theories that speak to that recovery. And this is important because it's likely that the kinds of processes or interventions that we would use, if you come into a situation and you want to do some change or transformation, you need to understand where things need to grow and where things need to release. And if we don't have good theories about that differentiate the growth and the release processes, we can't do that as well. Ascending is always going to be about learning something brand new that you could never do before. The descending release processes are always going to be about remembering something that was always already known, but hidden in plain sight. And these usually lead to like simple truths that feel hyper real with profound implications, often around themes of, just interconnectedness or basic goodness or emptiness. But they're very specific to each situation or each person or each group in terms of the structures that were previously built and assumed and that are now being released. And so this kind of insight generation is not about, even though it has this sense of being hyper real and important, it's not about learning something that is the case. I would propose it's always about learning something that is not the case. So we can release assumptions about capitalism or about individualism, nature, about our own history, assumptions we had about our parents or about ourselves. And this relates to what Sori was saying about that. It's the wisdom is the moment of releasing that. And then there's a cycle between these processes of release and growing. So then we can build up new insights on top of that. But that's an ascending process. And again, it's going to introduce some shadow that eventually we just have to keep an eye on. It's not to say that's not those aren't important moves. So in my work, I apply this idea to different places, like clearing up misconceptions about whether spiritual maturity is at the top of some developmental hierarchy or whether it actually points to the ever-present origin at the bottom. When can contemplative practice be harmful? Bonnie's going to talk to that. What is the level of complexity capacity that is needed to assimilate a particular depth of awakening? You can ask questions like that. How can enlightened teachers be assholes? You can address questions like that. What is indigenous wisdom? And it's also important to get into the sort of phenomenology of what it feels like to be in an ascending versus descending modality so that groups can self-regulate around these two moves. So finally, just again, coming back to, in terms of Consilience and this knowledge building project, is it possible to supplement these sort of ascending theories, principles coming together with something that might look like more non-conceptual, more embodied? And again, I know that people are already sensing into this, and I'm just trying to add to the theorizing of how we can frame it. But a consilience of unknowing or being, or a consilience of emptiness, intimacy. What would a consilience of the heart look like? That's it.
Hey, thank you, Tom. We will release your intervention and turn things over to the incomparable Mr. March. Where's my?
All right, thanks, Tom. Loads of resonance between our views, and so maybe this will be a bit of some continuity here. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm a coach. I've been a coach for the last 23 years, and I founded a coach training school called Aletheia. And my offering here is going to be a bit more like a field report, a little bit less academic, a little bit more from the trenches of being out there in the world, being sitting in front of people, being in corporations, leading groups, etc. And in my early days as a coach, like many coaches, I learned a lot of different coaching methodologies and some psychotherapeutic methodologies and ways of working with the body and a whole host of things. And the thing that I observed is that they all work. And I also observed that they all fail to work. And that observation was really the beginning roots of what I now do in Aletheia. And I began to wonder, what explains this? How do we understand why that can happen? And of course, these methodologies, as I'm sure you're all aware, are very, very diverse. And so what does this say about what it is to be human? That we have such a diversity of methodologies and they all work and yet they all fail. And there are a lot of different ways that we work with this that I can unpack. But in the short time that I have, I want to focus on two key elements that I work with in Aletheia. And one of them is depth. And this picks up Tom's theme of descending, actually both ascending and descending, because you can navigate depth in a surfacing way or in a deepening way. And essentially how it unfolded for me was I recognized that these methods work, but they work at different depths. And when the client is at a particular depth, that methodology, a methodology that specializes in that depth, works really, really well. But as soon as the client drops into a deeper depth or surfaces into a shallower depth, you move outside what I sometimes call the power pocket of that particular methodology. And now it no longer is powerful, it no longer works. And kind of to the theme of our symposium, possibly continuing forward with that methodology can actually do harm. And that, I think, is the sensitive question that we want to look at here. And that was certainly the thing that I noticed, is that I could see certain methods that were working sometimes, but that in other instances, coaching clients actually felt wounded by the application of that method. And how is that possible? So this is one explanation of that. And in Aletheia, we work with 4 different depths, and we have exemplar methodologies that specialize in each of those. And we have a way of integrating our work between those, because what I discovered is that actually in the span of sometimes it's merely seconds or minutes, clients are flowing up and down between these depths. And so what we needed to do was to have something that was a very fluid kind of methodology. Earlier, when I started to work with this, I had a different idea. And the idea was that we would work at one depth, and then it would the client would almost graduate to a deeper kind of work. And then after some period of time, they would graduate once more. And when I started to try to coach in that way, what I found was that that's not at all how it works. It's far more nonlinear, far more fluid. And so that's the first big discovery and way that we're experimenting in terms of dancing with the limits of method, which, if I were to give what I'm offering here a kind of subtitle, I think that's what I would offer: dancing with the limits of method. The other thing that I want to bring in here that unfolded as we were doing this dance is that actually there are different ideas about what transformation itself is. And even to talk about ascending and descending is one version of transformation, but there are other versions of transformation. And in Aletheia, we're working with 4 different kinds of transformation. And it would take a long time for me to actually unpack that model here. I'm not even going to attempt to, but just for the sake of giving you a little bit of language to hang something on, if you can, we work with, one way to understand this is that there's transformation that's really oriented around the question is, like, what is this? What is a human being? What are you feeling? What are you sensing in your body? And so the inquiry is very much working in that way. And this is very much a transmutative approach. But then there's an approach which is really focused on is not. Example of this might be something like emptiness meditations in a Buddhist context. Something, Tom, you were also referring to here. Recognizing that something that we perceive in a certain kind of way is actually not that, and seeing through, in some sense, into depth. Then, of course, you can talk about a kind of transformation that is somehow a union of those 2 sorts of transformation. And so you have a both and style of transformation. But then you have a neither nor style of transformation. And this neither nor style of transformation is actually the ultimate liberation, and it's the liberation from method itself. And so what happens there is that, you can kind of plug in lots of different dualities into the neither nor formula. We could explore neither existing nor not existing, neither dual nor non-dual, neither masculine nor feminine, and begin to notice that any of these distinctions that methodology can be formulated in terms of can ultimately be a limit to what can actually unfold there. And so, for me, having a methodology that is sensitive to the ways that methods have blind spots and the ways that methods have limitations is to recognize that we need to have a certain kind of fluidity with how we work, and that, in fact, even what we're doing, the transformation itself needs to be transformed. And the ultimate transformation is this kind of, sometimes I just call it the beyond. It's a place where the unfoldment, the transformation, the development goes off the map. That eventually the map itself, although the map itself was helpful along the road, eventually the map itself becomes a limitation, and that too must be let go of. And so, for me, as I look at different traditions in my own life, from my own practices, I am most called and most attracted to practices that don't sort of lock me into a particular view. They might have a view, but if you engage that view, if you engage those practices, that they're a kind of vehicle beyond it. And that there's something about that for me becomes trustable, in a sense, that we can actually, use a methodology to go beyond the methodology. It's self-transcending in some way, or self-liberating in some capacity. So that's what I wanted to add into the conversation so far, is a sensitivity towards that. And I will turn it over to Bonnie.
Thank you, Steve. All right. Everybody's probably got some experience of Bonnie, regular Bonnie, but prepare yourself for quintessential Bonnie.
Okay, thank you, Steve and Tom, and my friends. So I feel that I'm in good company here. I want to inject some provocative energy to kick off the Q&A here. And in doing so, I have the uncanny feeling that I have been invited to a birthday party and am going to complain about the cake. If I come across as hard-hitting, please know that I do not mean to be disrespectful. I've added some humor to lighten the load. Now, I respect John for his opening arguments because he seemed to be hitting hard. I'm not so sure who he was arguing with, though. But here, I'll let you know I am pushing back against some of the ideas presented in this conference because I'd rather you leave the conference with good questions instead of bad ideas. I believe that good questions can lead to consilience, and wisdom needs us to ask good questions in a hard way. First, let me give you an example of, that gives you the sense of what concerns me here in this conference. In Socrates' time, way back when, during the Axial Age, there was this guy named Zeno. And Zeno analyzed the flight of an arrow. His analysis led to the conclusion that movement from one place to another is impossible, because to get to that place, you first have to get halfway there, but to get halfway there, you'd first have to get a quarter of the way, and on and on. Of course, today, when we hear this, we become skeptical about the analytic process itself, not about the possibility of movement. There is actually an extremely complex mathematical proof that resolves the problem formally, But if we had to understand that proof before we could get from one place to another, we'd all be stuck in one place forever. What we do know is that our axial age minds, the kinds of minds we have today, can create riddles in this way about all kinds of things. That something is simultaneously is and is not. We can call all kinds of folk knowledge into question and come face to face with the specter of extreme doubt, or become stunned into a state of aporia. Now, only educated people are worried about these things, though, because they have been made neurotic enough to contemplate the problem, smart enough to conjure the riddle, but not smart enough to do the math. This leads to skepticism around the nature of the self, skepticism around the deep and real continuity of the physical, biological, and spiritual realms, something that was self-evident to pre-axial age peoples, and skepticism about reality itself, that perhaps we are completely unhinged and living in a simulation. The point here is that we must be careful that we are not fighting our own ghosts, that the existential problems we are fighting are not the very same ghosts that we have hypothesized in the first place, and that the very performance of fighting for what would otherwise be self-evident truths to the undoctrinated, especially when fighting for them with highfalutin concepts and extortionary reasoning, actually calls them into question. It's like we are constantly asking ourselves the question, how can you be so sure? A question that the mind cannot possibly resolve, and so it continues to drive itself upwards into more and more complex arguments. So let me share two experiences that I had in this conference so far that fall into this concern. The first experience. Yesterday, I learned people have to level up to get a grip on reality. You have to level up in order for reality to be intelligible. So I said to my dog, you have no chance at all of being in the world. Now, I think John has argued for a strong transcendence, but has a weak naturalism. He seems to think that a strong naturalism only leads to reductionism, which it doesn't. It only leads to reductionism if you still think that the only causal relationships down there are Newtonian billiard ball, bang and go kinds of relationships. So I would like us to question this idea. The second experience. Yesterday in a panel discussion on spirituality, 3 positions were called into question. 1, that real knowledge of the world is possible. 2, that meaning and value are real. And 3, that there is a real possibility for communication. Now, I don't mean that the presenter was being skeptical of these things. No, he was actually arguing for them. But in order to prove them, we were taken on a journey into cognitive thermodynamics, metaphysics, and opponent processing. And it seems to me that this is a kind of a way to invite skepticism about them. It's what Zeno was doing, except we have perfected the art of the riddle. It seems to me that the ongoing intellectual debates that will ensue puts these 3 fundamental existential truths out of the reach of most people. I said to my dog, yeah, there's really no hope for you at all. But my dog looked at me in a curious way, and I took that he was asking, when did people start to be skeptical about these 3 truths in the first place? I suppose, I said, from their education. I went on to explain how scientists and philosophers had made strong arguments that called them into question, and that I was witnessing some really strong arguments that put them back into the realm of the real. But my dog was already sleeping again and didn't hear any of it. So, you know, maybe there is a sorcerer among us. Maybe there is a fight to fight here. I don't know. What I do know is that the malware runs very deep. Ivan Illich said that at some point in Western culture, due to powerful systemic levers, there was an inflection point such that now The medicine makes you sick, the money makes you poor, and school makes you stupid. This would be funny if not for the statistics around physical and mental health, especially in the youth. In the US, the most advanced nation in the history of the world, 1 out of every 16 kids under the age of 20 are diagnosed with severe mental illness. I have seen too many kids walk out of the monastery and straight into a mental institution. So maybe the spirituality now makes us insane. Maybe metamodernism is characterized by this unique oscillation between the priest and the psychiatrist, between two rituals which share one thing in common, the analytic reductive examination of our minds. Maybe that signifies an inflection point in the wisdom industry, a sign of iatrogenic soteriology. In other words, without a strong naturalism, a strong transcendence does more harm than good. What I propose is a dialogue around the possibility of a deep continuity between a strong transcendence and a strong naturalism, that we find them to be, in fact, what Varela would call dynamically isomorphic. This might be a way forward toward consilience and the beginning of a wisdom commons. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Let's have all the speakers unmute themselves and go into a discussion around some of these questions. One thing that really stood out for me right from when Tom began is this question of what's the utility of having a discussion like this? What's the utility of theorizing this, right? Tom was saying a lot of people already know this. He's trying to contribute some kind of theory. What do we get from adding a theory and a discussion on these topics rather than, say, trying to address them through dance or through being in the woods or something like
that? This actually relates to a question that I popped into the morning session, which was in terms of the respond gathering. And my question was, what did it feel like for all of you to be there? And did the experience change any of you? And if it did change you, it probably wasn't because of the theories and ideas that were flying around. I'm not sure. I know the, I love the question. I think part of the answer, and I believe I got this from Bonnie some years ago, is that both culturally and individually, our shadow, our traumas are pretty complex knots. If they weren't difficult to untie, we would have done so. So there's all kinds of defense and counter defense mechanisms individually and culturally that keep these structures in place. And one could say that in order to figure out how to untie a knot, you have to have a level of complexity that can look at the knot and understand it and come up with some methods for trying to untie it. And maybe that's only true for people who are going to figure that out and tell the rest of us that what we have to do is, go and dance and that will solve it. And so maybe it's only a few people that need to do that, but that's perhaps part of the answer. But the question is more important than any answers there. Yeah.
I guess there's a variation of this question for everybody. For Steve, I would say something like, when does thinking the map is a limitation become a limitation?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I love, Bonnie, that the notion of malware, and the malware runs deep. And I think the question here, and it's sort of like weaving a lot of these themes together, is, we try to use the malware to fix the malware. And that's the trap that we're in, right? And it's almost inevitable. It's like, how can we not do that, right? It's absolutely inevitable that we will try to do that. I certainly can testify to that in the course of my own life. And so the trick is, how do we become liberated from that? You know, the metaphor that often jumps to mind when I start thinking down this particular lane are those finger handcuffs, you know, that you put your fingers in, and the harder you try to fight your way out of it, the more trapped you are, right? And so it's like, how do we learn to let go of fighting, to let go of trying to liberate ourselves from this, because the malware runs deep, and because we're using the malware to liberate ourselves from the malware. And I think that's the interesting angle here. And there are lots of different experiments for that. You know, one experiment might be something like, well, if there are limits and blind spots to method, let's just have no method. That's a legitimate experiment. What it usually reveals is that, in fact, unbeknownst to us, there are implicit methods already in play, and that so you can't really have no method. And so you need to have some kind of approach, some way to work with this, but that inside of that approach, there needs to be something that is obviously an openness to the world, an openness to reality, a letting go, space for the non-volitional, space for the emergent, space for surprise, space for wonder, different things like that start to crack things open. But we're not in control of that. And I think that's the thing that most of us really struggle with, is that we want to be in control of it. There's an urgency to be in control of it. And so I think this is an interesting thread that runs through this conversation.
What about you, Bonnie? What in yourself indicates to you that the kind of intervention you're trying to make today isn't part of the same problem you're addressing?
Yeah, I was just gonna actually start by saying, like, I get it. Like I love that example. Like, and so, for example, what I'm asking for is almost impossible or completely obstructed by the fact that we're on the internet, right? Here we are on the internet. And so there's this challenge with trying to use language that's not hyper complex and not necessarily poetic. Sometimes that works. It doesn't, but poetry works when you're already kind of in the silver stream of relationship. But I call it, the sage dances with language like the shaman dances with energy. And there's a sense of trying to use language that can point to what's already implicit in the person. And it's a really interesting dance. For some people who are hyper intellectual, you end up using a lot of hyper intellectual language. You're just trying to exhaust the complexity of the person in front of you until they have no other choice. And early on, or mid-career in the integral theory community, I realized that, I mean, I like to read and I'm very curious, but a lot of what I was reading and why I was reading is so that when I was challenged by trying to articulate fundamental truths, people would say, oh, but, and they would make something, a little more complex, but I had already read that. So I could say, yes, but, blah, 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 blah. And then they'd say, yes, but, and then they argue it. And not until I could prove that I could track all that complexity did I say, maybe she's got something there. So I really have experienced it. I also think this is a reason why we have a problem with women in this space, because of this leveling up, there's this like kind of competition to see if what you have to say, why isn't that just folklore? Like, why isn't that just pre-trans? Well, maybe someone like me can prove that it's not pre-trans. And a lot of my work has gotten me to the point that I can read something like this that's not very complex. And so this is a problem in this community, that you know, that these fundamental, the kinds of body minds we are today, we worry about these things. You know, Lena said yesterday that X number of people in Europe, kids, think the penis can grow back, right? Now, this is not some folk wisdom they were born with. This is in like their education, in the medical nemesis, and this trafficking. And there's this guy in Turkey I saw on the internet that that he's now has an organ vault where when kids get rid of their penises, then he gives the penis to the woman kid that needs a penis and breasts, and he's just trading these organs back and forth. He's like, why not, you know? And this is a kind of insanity. And so I think that we have these kinds of body minds that worry about these things. And it's the kinds of body minds we have today. And so I really want to warn people in the community is, you know, what are you exacerbating? What are you giving energy to? And what are you, you know, are you taming the mind? And I'll just end with like one of the questions I have is, when a lot of these meditative traditions came out, people had sluggish minds. You know, they weren't talking to people that thought the world was a simulation. And right now we have the problem where kids, by the force of the internet and just the way these ideas, they don't think the world is real. That's a problem. And so maybe we shouldn't be teaching them emptiness. I don't think so. This is a real problem. I think it has an ethical component to it.
One of the things I worry about in terms of iatrogenics is the kind of stagnation that comes from people who have excellent things to say, but give them to you in a professional, rehearsed manner. You know, like if we were to bring Ken Wilber into this space, and he's got tremendous contributions that he's made and still could make, but he'd probably say something formulated in a way we've already all heard before. And that's a risk that we all suffer from. So I'm curious from all three of you, do you feel like you said anything today so far that you haven't said before?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Well, I have to say that this idea of working on a project between combining a strong naturalism to a strong transcendence is something that obviously I just thought of when I was listening to John, and trying to let that percolate as a positive project. And I think that it has potential to be interesting for, you know, two sides of the coin. So that was something that was new for me today, that concept of a project.
The thing that I'm sitting here with a curiosity, and I don't mean to interrupt, Layman, but it's like, so it seems like we all accept that the malware runs deep. We all accept that there are ways that we can attempt to move forward that ultimately undermine us or sabotage us, or maybe even are harmful sometimes. But that we do that because they're not always harmful. That there are, you know, there are ways that these methods can help. The question that I'm constantly considering is how do we navigate that space? And how do we learn to more skillfully navigate that space, where it's not so much a matter of saying something like, you know, that approach is outright wrong, never use it again. And this one is always right, switch to this one. It's a far more nuanced kind of reality that we face. And how can we actually learn to navigate that? I'm very curious about that question.
Yeah, there's a question I had in response to what you were saying earlier, Steve, that's similar to that, which is you were talking about watching how methodology escapes its power pocket and then starts to have insignificant or even problematic results in the other person. And what came up for me was, what does it take to detect and validate that response in the other in order to acquire that piece of information that there's a limit to the method? Right? I think one of the things we see, Tom mentioned asshole gurus or something like that. Right. And one of the problems with teachers of that kind is their inability to detect and validate certain kinds of betrayal or suffering experiences in their students. So what does it take from us? What kind of affective intelligence is needed for us to be able to make the detections in the other that would give us that information?
Yeah, there's definitely the affective component. I mean, I think a lot of what we're pointing to here, probably obvious to everyone in this space, is it's something. I mean, there is a there in that we're pointing towards a non-conceptual, felt sense way of being together as part of what needs to be supported. So that question of what does it feel like in your body to be moving in one direction or another, and building up that capacity that I spoke to. But in terms of the collective and even the asshole guru question, actually a lot of these patterns you won't feel in your body unless you are in connection with other people's bodies, because that's where the patterns that you hold culturally, maybe it's patriarchy or whatever, they actually you don't even feel them, so in order to know that you have that kind of occlusion in your system, you have to interact with somebody else who's suffering because of that pattern culturally, and then you can begin that learning process. So just like we have to get parts of ourselves talking to each other as we go deeper and open up, we have to have those dialogical processes for some of these patterns to surface, I think.
I think that there, with a little bit of effort, I think these questions are answerable to a certain extent. Like you could have certain principles, right? So one of the things, for example, I teach about is, why do you call it mindfulness? And there's this guy, River Kenna, who's doing really good work. I just discovered him. And then Ethan also, that I don't know how to say his last name, that Greg talked about. I mean, these people, I think, are wisdom teachers. They're young and they've got a really good program. And so why do we call it mindfulness? Why do we say put your attention on the breath, right? This already puts you into phenomenon in your mind versus what does it feel like to breathe? Where does the impulse for the next breath arise? So these little changes are huge. They're really huge. And I think that a lot of teachers don't know that they're prompting the body to gesture toward the very problem that they're supposedly trying to solve. So there's a whole host of little ideas like that. But I think one of the things to really zoom out is that we have to understand a couple of things, and that is we cannot ground the reasons for what we're doing on reason. At some point you have to declare why it matters to you and say, this is axiomatic to me. So Maple does this. Preservation of life on Earth. He's not going to come up with a reason why that should be the first principle. And so when I think we are doing this work as teachers, we should be able to declare what is this energy, where is this energy coming from? What does it matter to me? So for me, it matters, it's heartbreaking to see what younger generations, what their starting point is in school. And also it's heartbreaking, always been, to see how we destroy the earth. So then you can say whether these technologies work for coaching or whatever, do they work for what matters most to you? And then see if that change is happening in the world. And I think that if teachers could declare what's their first principle, and that's the largest context we can put it in. We can't justify it by our own methods. We just have to say, this is where I'm at. This is the energy arises in this form through me, and I don't really have any control over it. So I think there's a lot of techniques like that I think can really help answer some of these conundrums or untangle them anyways.
Thing that comes up for me, going back to Steve's curiosity, is that there are a lot of kind of basic practices we could use that would allow people in general, but especially children as they develop, to become more participatorily intelligent about contexts. Right? When do we use this one, given that it can't be used for everything? And it seems like there's a certain way of relating to children where you could say, on the one hand, that's a bad word, we don't say that word, or we don't say that word around grandma, we don't say that word at school, right? Sort of build in participatory contextual capacity. Other things that might do that would be things like the Japanese art of flower arranging, like, given this, how do you get the best thing out of it? But only given this. So there's a kind of, I think we could get a lot richer in our ability to understand and work with context, and that would lead to a better instinct for when and where to apply which methodologies.
One of the ways that I think about this as well, and it fits in with our idea, with our notion of iatrogenic, is through the idea of inoculations. Like, how can we inoculate ourselves in some way? We can't prevent ourselves from erring, but are there ways? I think, Bonnie, some of what you're naming are some of those inoculations. Like, they're not a fix, like a permanent fix, but they're a way that we can start to attend to the possibility that our ways can actually not work, that we're to mix metaphors again, that we're using the malware to try to fix the malware. One of the ways that I experiment with another form of this inoculation is, I like to say that although I hold the role of coach, that I am not the coach, that reality is the coach. And that instead what I'm doing is I'm apprenticing reality. So I'm curious about what's here, what's arising in the field, what's arising in the field of relatedness, what's arising in our bodies, what are we feeling? And to keep reverting to that as an invitation as well for the client to actually apprentice what's arising. Now, of course, we know what's arising, there's all kinds of distortions, and we have interpretations, and we have layers and layers of that. But that's actually what we then start to work with and become more aware of. We bring it into the foreground, we become more conscious of it, and we learn to begin to see through that, to see around it, to see over it, to open up more and more and more. So it's sort of like the path forward from being in this malware kind of situation is available in every moment, and yet it's not. It's often blocked and occluded. And I think, Tom, you were pointing to this as well in what you started to open with. That there's something fundamentally here that is covered over, and and so I'd like to think that it's not a matter of getting to the starting point or getting onto the path, that the path is here, it is available in some capacity, and we can kind of find our way out of the malware from within that. So I know as a coach, when I was starting out, I didn't have this view. I very much took on the mantle of being the coach. And what I was confronted with again and again, as I tried to do that, as I tried to offer my clients something, as I realized, I don't know what to say here. I don't know what's actually happening here. And so, but I was being looked at by them as someone who should know. I was being trained by other people to be one who knows. I was trying that on, and it was actually being honest with myself and recognizing that doesn't work, that I started to open up into this other view, which I actually find that when I'm not trying to do it, it actually happens much more effectively. So anyway, that's one inoculation that I've been playing with, and I think as I think both Bonnie and Tom are also pointing to this, that to use this language of inoculations, that there are, perhaps dozens of these kinds of things that we can start to work with, none of which prevents harm from being done, but that helps us to navigate the nuances of this.
Yeah, I just want to say, I read Tom's paper, and he has something that's extremely valuable here that I'm not sure he even sees. I think he's very proud of his paper. He knows it's excellent. But it's like, we have to be careful that he's describing the kinds of minds we have today. It goes up and occludes, it goes up and occludes. But this is not the nature of mind. This is the nature of the kinds of learning that we have today. So he's got so much information about the nuance and what to watch and how it works, that now we can then say, what would it be like to educate so that we don't occlude when we add? This is a fascinating question, because if we just say, well, that's how it is, of course, that's how it is now. But the more we understand the dynamics of this beast, the more we can tame it. And I think that I always give Tom these ideas, and then, and then I go off and fly away and don't do anything. But he does this like amazing work on some of these ideas. So I would say that this is a fascinating question. Like, how can I, and once you start asking it, you, as a teacher, you find yourself, oh, I was going to do that, but I'm not. I'm just not going to do that. I'm just not going to let the energy up the ante. Okay, now I'm confronted with something I have to do with my body, rearrange myself in such a way that I get another idea, or I just sit there. Like, and this percolates moment to moment in the person themselves. So Tom, I don't know if you feel that way about your work, or you see the possibility in that. And so maybe you could speak to it. You might have some ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is, I can relate this to Layman's question about children and teaching them context. Children are naturally context aware, and animals are naturally context aware. So that's how the mind works before it gets enculturated, I think. So an interesting question is like, how and why do we stop that from happening in the mind as it naturally exists? I think there are answers in two directions. I won't get into in any detail, but one is, I think the most, probably the deepest malware program is language itself. And the way that language functions, we can't have culture, we can't share knowledge, at least at the way we do it today, without language. So it's a given. And yet, just the nature of having a symbolic way of communicating is constantly splitting the world. You know, when you say this is a dog, then there are all these things that aren't dogs. And so then you have to use all these language games and tricks to acknowledge the fact that well, maybe there are things in between dogs and not dogs, and maybe there are things that are outside the whole question of whether something is a dog or not. But the language instinct is a fundamental piece of the malware that, you know, creates these problems, takes away children's native capacities. And another has something to do with how we instill just the intergenerational trauma, how we bring in fear into the learning practice. So that creates certain kinds of black and white categories and rigidities, and puts blinders on. And so, Bonnie, to your question, I think we can always try to reduce the occlusion that happens. And especially if we learn more about the kinds of occlusions that happen because of the way we use language and categories and the way we teach and share culture, and you know, really understand more of how we are and can be doing that more without language per se or whatever. I think we can reduce a lot of the harmful occlusion, but also a deeper part of the theory is that every new structure, whether it's language or not, I mean, even structures in physics and chemistry, when a structure comes into being, it solves some previous problem. And in doing so, it occludes prior possibilities. So there's something more fundamental there to say that you can't learn without occluding, but you can certainly minimize the damage, and maybe you can increase the process of reflecting on and discovering what that occlusion actually is, and then going back and doing the release work.
I just wanted to highlight two things. So this first thing you said about, you know, even animals have context, that's what I would call the argument from strong naturalism. I think that move can help solve a lot of this stuff. Like, for example, animals can simulate the environment in their mind, right? So now, like, whoa, what is simulation? Well, it's not that ethereal. It's not really that transcendent. It's something we get from our animal nature. And so if we can go back to a strong naturalism, we can start to reimagine the growth or the evolution of these capacities into the human. But I think we have to have a strong naturalism. We can't say, well, then there's emergent, and now our simulations are you know, so that's what I'm talking about, a strong naturalism. And secondly, I love this comment you said on language. But for example, I'm writing supposed to be writing a book on transformative education for Perspectiva, and it starts with this notion of saying that the teacher should say without naming. And I talk about the Tao Te Ching, and it starts off, the Tao Te Ching is like it starts off with like the Tao that can be spoken of is not the real Tao. We all know this, but the whole point is that the day in the Tao Te Ching is the virtue. So what is the virtue of not saying, not naming? And this is actually a skill that you could teach young people, because what we do is we use language in a way that hypothesizes the reification of things. And so you could convene, like, this is like, you know, as Zach would say, social miracles. Your teachers aren't going to come and learn how to say without naming. But for a wisdom tradition, this is a practice at a high level that you can undergo. And what would it be like if what's coming out of my mind felt like something I was saying but not naming? It would appeal to my aesthetic judgment, not my rational judgment, to tie it into something we were talking about. So I think, while you're right, Steve, that the territory is hopelessly complex and we're stuck in the middle, I think there's real progress that we're situated right now in these initiatives that I'm very grateful for to work on. I think it's not the inflection toward iatrogenic. I think that's happening naturally. It's an inflection point that can move in the opposite direction.
So there have been 10,000 fantastic questions in the chat, and I'm not even going to try to stay on top of those, but if people want to raise their hand and offer some questions, this might be a good time to start doing that. Chris, go ahead.
Hey everyone, thanks for the great conversation. Yeah, what struck me was Bonnitta talking to a dog. And so my question is about how do each, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
So how do each of you work towards cultivating a hermeneutics of beauty and getting over a hermeneutics of suspicion of reality and education and all of these ideas that young people are struggling with today? Thank you.
Yes, I can start. I mean, I started to speak about that in the session with Nathan earlier. You know, I think it's actually the first move, the first and biggest and most important move is the shift into the poetic attunement. You know, in contrast to the technological attunement, the poetic attunement can include the technological attunement, but it is much more expansive than that. And so the way that in a practical sense, the way that we take this poetic attunement is through attuning to the world through a love of truth, beauty, and goodness for its own sake. And we have to take this kind of attunement for its own sake, which is kind of back to what, Bonnie, you were talking about in terms of simply declaring declaring our orientation, and then also not giving it justification in some sense, because to do so disempowers the declaration. And so, we actually have to step into a poetic attunement, in my view, in order for all of this to unfold and to address this. The more we stay inside the technological view, where everything is viewed as a capacity or a function or something like that, the more we close down to dimensions of reality that are vitally important to integrate in these times. This is one way that I do it.
Yeah, I appreciate the idea of the poetic attunement, including technology, because my response to Chris would be, there's a poetic attunement to suspicion that transforms its flavor. One of the things I say to kids is there's a posture of being quizzical. And when you're quizzical, you're skeptical, you're suspicious, but not with a bad conscience. So I think there's a postural and active behavioral mode by which we can sort of leverage poetic attunement, even in the kinds of intelligence that traditionally go along with skepticism, cynicism, and suspicion. Okay, how about Thorson?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, my question is how, like, rules of thumb or principles for communities of practice that want to kind of diagnose iatrogenic effects of their training. Like, how would we go about as a community revealing and targeting like specific iatrogenic impacts of the particular training system that we're using?
I think one good heuristic is ask the people who leave the community.
I think it requires a deep self-examination. And humility to know that we're all at risk to doing harm. I mean, I read this book once. It's a beautiful book, but it'll break your heart, called Raising Parents. And it's about the psychology of trying to save kids from traumatic upbringing by parents who themselves are traumatized or are mentally ill. And the entanglement is very, very difficult. And the idea is to try to heal the child through intervention with the parent. But it starts off, this woman says, but we have all ourselves damaged parents and damaged children in the process. Like, I think that this ability to be with what is in a community that, for example, you're in, is the power to solve this question and to be responsible in this way. Does that make sense? I think that, yeah, great question.
I would just add to this that, I mean, it's a complex question, but in a simple way, it's like, how are you as a community responding to the hurts that arise? It's not so much preventing them. Yes, we want to do everything we possibly can to prevent it in a certain kind of way, but it's sort of inevitable as well. How are we responding? I'll give you some examples. Sometimes we respond to it by simply blaming the other person. We split off, we say that's the problem. And there's some kind of sort of relational something that connects us that starts to get split and cut. And one of the ways this shows up is, I've seen it in many different groups and organizations, is as a kind of distrust that begins to grow. And ultimately it can land into scapegoating, which is the most extreme form of it. And so whenever I'm doing work in organizations, my litmus test as I walk through organizations is I'm constantly trying to sense the gradient of trust, and really kind of following it towards the areas and the pockets of distrust in organizations, because I know that perhaps more than anything, if I can help an area in an organization where there is some distrust, address that and start to rebuild trust, that the effects are numerable and have a rippling effect through the entire organization. So that for me is, I think, one answer to a very complex question that probably has many answers.
I can add one.
Another good heuristic, sorry, Tom, is just don't do anything all the time, because you're inherently blind to something if it's all around you. So unless there are breaks from your practice, you won't know if your practice is having negative effects or not, because you'll be so inside it. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. I love the responses given so far. They're very resonant to what I might say. And one particular thing that comes up, there's a process called the Oracle that's being developed by Daniel Hayes and his partner, Lena, that is a circle group process that encourages people to not only speak from their own truths and from their heart and things like that, but to allow voices to come into them or sort of be channeled through them that may not be present in the room. So, and it can turn into a very chaotic, liminal space, there's a particular structure. But so it goes a little bit beyond just like asking people what's alive in your body as a person here. You can speak for the group, you can speak for people that aren't there. And of course, it's all channeled through an individual, but it creates a different kind of opening. So just one little pointer.
Excellent. Okay, Edward, what have you got for us?
This discussion has brought back to my mind a very fierce and intense discussion on the Facebook discussion forums when the book The Dawn of Everything came out by Graeber and Wengrow. And particularly, part of the reaction against it was this notion that we have of development, and that the indigenous are so-called less developed. And Graeber and Wengo challenged that. So I'm wondering, first of all, if you guys have read the book, and how do you respond to these arguments for and against so-called development with the indigenous wisdom?
Read the book. I really enjoyed the book. Sometimes their slant was a little too strong for me. But in general, I think they did good work in opening up the terrain that any developmental theory has to take seriously. It's much more complex than sort of simple linear models give it credit for. And one of the ways I personally handle that is with a coaxial approach, where the degree of integration is different from the number of types of patterns that you consciously are able to recognize relative to how you've adapted to a particular techno-social phase of human development. So I think there's no limitation on an anatomically modern human being relative to how integrated they could be, right? There's no, you're too early to be able to do this fantastic level of development. All the levels are available at all of the so-called socio-historical stages. And in fact, some of the earlier stages might afford a greater possibility of integrative development simply because there are perhaps fewer pieces of social information to integrate, and because the lifestyle is one that's closer to what the human organism is adapted for. So I think there's a tremendous amount of richness to be found in rethinking how profound the indigenous might be, and then trying to fit that together somehow with a complex developmental model.
Just a quick thing. Respond has recorded a conversation on what is the relationship between wisdom and complexity. And it's part of, I don't know how they're going to use it, whether it's going to be in a course or something, between myself, John Vervaeke, and Thomas Steininger, which gets into some of the weeds there. So I don't want to go into that, but I know that there is a media being produced for that.
A couple of things I could say. There's been a lot of critique, as many of you know, on the concept of development and models of development. And certainly the models that we have now are very simplistic. But the core of the idea of development, this is worked out by Commons and Fisher in different ways, is just that some kinds of capacities build on other capacities. It's very simple in that sense. Complexity happens when one thing builds upon or operates on or integrates other capacities. And a lot of what we do, most of what we do involves a process like that. So you can't get around the core idea of development, although it can look in so many different ways that we don't imagine, kinds of intelligences that we don't see in our cultures. Another thing that I'd like to point out, and so of course you've got those dynamics of development, but then you also need the dynamics of release to go on top of that, which is part of what I was presenting. There's different ways to try to understand what sort of, Aboriginal wisdom might look like and how it might compare to what we in modernity we think of as wisdom. But because there's, but one of the things that is useful to note is because of this transcend and exclude dynamic, we don't see the parts of us that are hidden. And so if you walk into, like, say, a circle of Native American grandmothers or something, some culture that hasn't lost most of what we as modern Westerns has lost, they can just look at you within a couple of words, or just looking at how you walk or the energy of your body. It's very apparent to them what you have left behind in your development, and it's things that we can't even see. So so part of it has to do with wisdom that gets built up developmentally through complexity, which can look like all kinds of things, being able to to hunt in the forest and so forth can be extremely complex and sophisticated. But also it's just that when you haven't built certain occlusions, you can actually see more of the world, the things that you never left behind. So those are other kinds of treasures that exist for us when we interact with cultures different than ours.
I'd also say there's a time frame trap, right? I think Graeber and Wengrow do a really good job of exploring how modernity's implicit assumptions retroactively predispose them to being able to perceive a certain kind of history, which then inevitably proceeds toward that modernity. And that's on a particular time scale. We tell this story of the last 6,000 years, and that gives us a particular way of thinking about developmental stages. But like I was saying in my talk on spirituality yesterday, the majority of it, spirituality, religion, development, has occurred prior to writing, prior to cities, prior to the last 6,000 years, which is in a way a very small and perhaps non-representational slice of what we've been doing as developmental beings. Holly, hi.
Hi, thank you so much. This is sort of aimed towards Tom. So something that's just come up for me during this conference has been a little bit of an irritation with the word transcendence, sort of in our more modern spirituality, the sense that part of this transcendence is underlying that notion is like escaping the body, which I think has also led to, so sort of seeing like, oh, this body is uncomfortable. This isn't where I want to be, which I think also plays out with our relationship to the earth, that, you know, we want to escape this reality, we want to escape this realm in some ways. I mean, part of the etymology of that word transcendence is rooted in the notion of escaping, which I think has caused a lot of issues. I think that's also part of like why we're destroying the earth in some ways. We're trying to escape it. So one, I'm just sort of wondering what you think about that. And also this notion too of inclusion and exclusion. Because when I look out into nature, there isn't really inclusion or exclusion. It all just seems to be shape shifting. You know, you exclude something, but it's actually now included in a new sort of field or realm. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about inclusion and exclusion.
Yeah, well, as to the first question, I just think the concept of transcendence is very problematic for us. And it would be good if we found other words to talk about what we're talking about there. You know, I was pointing to the notion of volume, you know, increasing altitude and perspective taking, combined with releasing into ever deeper levels of sort of what's available in the psyche. Yeah, I just think it's a word that leads to, it can't help but lead to a certain kind of hubris and also spiritual bypassing and all the things that you pointed to. So it's a problematic concept for us. Could you say a little more about inclusion, exclusion, what your question is there? That we always say, when you're saying that I'm always that I'm saying that building new structures always includes an exclusion. Is that the question?
Oh yeah, I guess I'm just noticing that things just, from what I see, there isn't really nature exclusion or inclusion. It just all seems to be shaping or shifting shapes.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, well, nature doesn't have this problem that we seem to have, but what you could say is that when a species develops genetically in a certain direction with certain senses and capacities, if those things work, they tend to get locked in place. And so for that species, you've kind of excluded all the other possibilities of ways that it could have met its needs with the environment. So, and then you're kind of locking in place solutions that if the environment changes, it's kind of stuck and it has to unlearn those or die away, and something else will emerge from it. So that's what I meant. That's how that would apply to something that's not about human cognition. And it's not, in terms of nature, it's whatever's happening in nature, we can assume is just kind of good by itself. It's not like it should happen in any other way. Does that answer your question?
Go ahead, Bonnie.
So I know Holly, so I think the question kind of informs me a little more than you. But what I want to point out is, so I agree with John that our minds are isomorphic to nature. The nature of our minds is isomorphic to the nature of nature. Why? Because it's nature. But the kinds of minds we have today is not isomorphic to nature. So I think that's what Holly's saying. Like, if she really relaxes, I know her, I know where she can go. She sees that the inclusion is projected onto her relationship with nature by the kind of mind she has. And so again, I mean, this is the rigor in which we need to address some of these language games, let's say. But I do believe in strong transcendence. This may actually surprise you. And I think that what I do is, when something never goes away, however much of an allergy I have to it, I say it's real, but it's misunderstood, it's misinterpreted. And I believe that what is transcendent in the human experience is our actions. We don't know why we do them. We have no idea what they will lead to, and yet we must act. And I think this is the transcendent vector of the human experience. If you know my origins of the self, it's that, how do we show up and act? And this makes every act sacred and meaningful. And it makes the kind of subject I am causally powerful. This is the kind of language I think leads to healing the environment, to healing this insanity. So that's what I would argue is a strong transcendence that is embedded in a strong naturalism.
Anything you want to add, Steve?
I'm sitting here with this question. I think it's in the circle of this is, given what we're understanding about, about what you've articulated, Tom, about this, this ascending path and then this descending path. And Bonnie, I think you were pointing to this earlier as well. Is it possible to actually traverse the ascending path, which is a path, as I understand it, of structurization, in a way that the structures don't exclude, but that somehow are porous, if I could bring that metaphor in. And I'm beginning to wonder as well if that's perhaps something that indigenous populations have learned to do. And so we somehow view that as, from our current view with the minds that we believe we have, as somehow primitive, but maybe it's actually quite advanced, more advanced than what we actually have. So that's what I'm sitting here with.
So this is exactly the kind of conversation we need to have, because what we need to do through a contemplative practice is experience what's in our body when our minds are tempted or compelled to grow in this direction. And you will find there's an embodied root knot that we're running away from. And that has been known by the indigenous people for a long time, and then a number of different things. So the question is not to take for granted, why is the mind implicated in the complexity by chasing it? Why does the mind have this response to grow in that direction? And you'll find there's something in the lived experience that cannot be faced. And this is the history of what the non-Western, non-colonialized people see about the Western mind. It's very clear to them. It's very obvious. It's so simple, it can hardly be spoken of. So that's a practice that we need as a community to put in place.
One of the places that connects with work I've been doing lately, my own personal work, is the question of, I think at the bottom of most of this, if not all of this, is the question of where and how do I not feel safe in this body, in this context, with these people, or on this earth. I think that is how I lately have identified that kind of what's the embodied sense at the bottom of these moves to try to create more complexity is I don't feel safe. And then how to resource different modes of the safety that actually exists in reality in this moment, and be aware of those as a counter move.
One of the distinctions that I'm experimenting with in my work is that there's two kinds of structure. One that is fragmenting, which is the kind that excludes, but that there's another kind of structure, which in some traditions they call subtle structure, which is integrative fundamentally because it's holographic. And so both structure has a phenomenology of a kind of stability when we land into it. And I think you're right, Tom, that a lot of times there's a creation of structure because we're trying to get to something we can trust. We're trying to get to some sort of stability, some sense of safety. These are what psychological defenses are. But we know that defenses are also sabotaging us because they fragment, they put us out of contact with ourselves and each other, etc. So I think that's an interesting thread in this.
Yeah.
Elena.
Hi. My question is, could it be said that confinement, being a planetary occurrence, could function and be functioning at this time as a punctuated equilibrium that opens up possibilities of pathways that are already transforming us, like this event right here that we say virtual, as if that's separate from anything else. As Bateson used to say, I sometimes catch myself thinking that anything is separate from anything else. And I feel that we are already being transformed in the work that I'm happy to join Bonnitta in the work that she's doing right now, feels absolutely vital in even perceiving what's actually already happening to us, not as something we have to build, but as something that's already transforming us. As if the question is, how does an organism learn how to evolve? Because that's what we are. And that's that naturalistic aspect that has been in a Procrustean, bed of industrialized habit at a very accelerated pace with a tremendous appetite for assessment. And I would just add that a very young person, 23 years old, got up in front and risked his whole life to say God and nature are inseparable 400 years ago. And something might have gone very differently if he hadn't been excommunicated and he hadn't written a line yet. And instead we have 1 out of every 16, like Bonnitta said, of that youth, that uncommitted potentiality in depression or dream suppressants. So I'm not sure if I've articulated where my inquiry feels most urgent, but I think it's already happened.
I think we feel your urgency.
Well, and this is part of our response and growing response able.
Yeah. In my work, I often draw the distinction between what I call the improvement paradigm, which I think is the prevailing paradigm, which is this, assessment-based Procrustean sort of paradigm that you were naming, and the unfoldment paradigm, which sometimes I talk about as a new paradigm, but really what I mean is it's the primordial paradigm, that unfolding is living and living is unfolding. And a lot of the work that I'm doing is to try to bring back to prominence the primordial, because it got us here, and somehow we've decided we're going to take over for it. And I question whether, well, it doesn't seem like that's working out, to say it mildly.
No.
I don't think that's working out. Yeah.
It does. It reminds me of just the sort of classic non-dual path wisdom of how is it that what you desire or need is always already happening? It's a good question.
Alistair.
Yeah. First of all, thank all of you. I really love all your work and I love all your contributions here today. And I like the pit in my stomach that Bonnie gave me with her talking today. My question to y'all is, let's assume that the malware does run deep. Let's assume that the malware is in the very structure of the way we think. Therefore, all of us attempting to give answers as to this is the way forward, or this is how things work, or this is how things don't work, is problematic by its very nature. And assuming that, how do we then, from your point of view, cultivate an attitude or a mode or a way of being that can give us some kind of possibility or some kind of chance to have some success moving forward out of this crisis that we find ourselves in that's so pressing? And then maybe an adjunct to that is, I'd like to know, what are the practices that you find useful for yourself in doing that? Thank you.
I'll start, but what comes to mind is perhaps we can assume that what the three of us are speaking to in different ways for each of us comes from a kind of knowing that we have that is below aside from or other than language. And so we're using language and theory to try to do something here with a knowledge building community. But we all have this stuff that we know that's prior to language. So it's already there. I'll stop with that. And when I say all of us, I don't mean the panel, I mean all of us here together, so.
Sorry, I've been attending to the chat. It's very sophisticated conversations everywhere. Practices that, okay, there's a couple of things that I would want people to help me with. And one is that it's the people doing this work, Soteriology told us this the last day of the conference. He's like, well, he said to the teachers, it's never been about you anyways. And he pointed to the young people who were doing the supporting, that it was up to them. And it was like, we were all excited about all the content we had created. And he's like, well, you don't have to worry what we're going to do with that, because he goes like this, it's not about you anyways. And I think this is a stance that we have to take. And so for me, it's this question I've been ever since, that first ITC conference when I was talking about Gebser, I've been looking for where is the new mind emerging today. So we talked about River Kenna and Ethan, I can't say his last name, Michael Levin. These are people that are going to revolutionize the understanding of mind and matter. Ian McGilchrist. And all these people are moving closer toward a panpsychic or pan-experiential. Michael Levin says that every agent is a causal agent. He uses the term physics, but he means that matter and molecules are causal agents, and that at every different, he has a level, so he's not flatland, that each causal agent has a cognitive light cone. So can see certain things and has certain causal properties and causal freedom. Now, if you tie this in with the sense that the transcendent is the action, is the causal properties of the act, then that means there's a transcendent element in every one of these levels, let's say. And so one of the practices I do is I search for and I try to support people who seem to have these intuitions already, but they don't have a grammar. So we work really hard, like at the pop-up school, we're building a new theory of the body that puts the mind back into the body and the body back into nature. And we hope that this would be helpful. And so I think the Respond Network is also, I mean, we're here talking about this incredibly sophisticated argument. But I think as teachers, we need to be able to see the gems that are arising just by the force or the impulse, the evolutionary impulse, and highlight them and not spend so much time compounding knowledge in the university. And one thing Michael Levin says is that for 40 years, we've been moving toward abandoning the notion of the connectome as how the brain works. And yet they still teach in college, Neuroscience 101, that that's how our brain works. So this is another problem, that there's this complete dismissal of the actual gems and activity and revolutionary thought that's happening today. And I think, and I accuse some of the wisdom practices of teaching 17th century neuroscience and basing their interpretations of the Dharma on outmoded cognitive science. And so I think that that's part of the challenge here, or our obligation.
I just threw a link to my new course because practices are my whole life. There's no way to quickly address that, but you might want to check out a course or retreat or something like that. On the question of how we do sense making around this in a world where we're already embedded in the malware, I think being good natural scientists as sort of a peer community is an important part of that, right? So we all have experiences that we think are more authentic and more free of the distortion, more free of the bias. We might be correct, we might not be correct, but if we can share those experiences more clearly with each other, probably the parallax of all that will give us a much better sense of what the objective situation is there.
What I want to add to this is that what if it's really about letting be, letting unfold? What if it's more the art of not doing? And the real challenge, I think, that we face in these times, of course, there's the challenge of the meaning crisis and the meta crisis, and we don't have to go into that because we're all familiar with that. And there is this real, genuine urgency to respond in some kind of way, and yet the responses that we habitually make to that only make the situation worse in some sense. And so we have to do this odd thing of like both feeling the urgency and genuinely responding, but what if the response is something that is really out of character for us in a certain kind of way? You know, what if it's really more about a kind of not doing what we've been doing? And of course, that is super challenging because we have all kinds of good intentions behind what we're currently doing. Intentions to protect us, intentions to defend ourselves, to save each other, et cetera, et cetera. And that, I think, is a really, really tough problem to solve. But I think that's what we're really faced with, and it really is an ownership of what we've been talking about this entire conversation, which is the limits to what to the methods and the approaches and the practices that we currently have. Those limits are being brought to the fore by the challenges that we're facing, and there's a real opportunity there's an opportunity for a creative response, an opportunity for something that is not just a practice that we already know about that we can do again and again and again and again. So this is kind of the direction that my thinking goes in, which is, how can we learn to get out of the finger trap, the metaphor I was using earlier? You don't fight harder, you relax. You stop fighting, you do something really different. And so I think that's the thing. It's like, maybe we don't know what that is yet. I mean, we have ideas about it. We can experiment. I think that's what these times call for, but it's an experiment in that kind of direction, in which we own our not knowing. We own the limits of our current view. That's the tricky thing about this.
We win. Have you got a question for us?
I do, and sort of a comment. Thank you. And I think my question is landing just at the perfect time too. One of the things I'm thinking about, especially reading Greg Enriquez's new book, and also John talks about it in his series of bioeconomy. And I think in a way, alluding to what Bonnitta, you were talking about action. I think of action as, if I feel actually relaxed, that's the ultimate litmus test, right? Does this really work? So my question is, and we've been talking about practice for the last couple of minutes, and to me, that's the ultimate in the embodied experience is the ultimate in naturalism. So I'm questioning, what is the role of practice? Because we've been reifying, we talk about all these conceptualizing everything, but I think in a way there is also, we're going to be beckoned into moving into areas that we've never experienced before, with a lot of VUCA, a lot of uncertainty, and there seems to be more than just the need to declare and define and create psychotechnologies, but what's the, your question, Layman, about what methods to use, and then to open up that whole thing, to slam the door wide open to what Steve was talking about in the beginning, is opening about what's the dance between methods, what is the psychotechnology jazz that we, and in that, living into these processes, living into this experience of like participatory and the development of perspectival knowing, and to develop new perspectives, and really, in a way, living into different worlds, and maybe even creating a few. So that's kind of my question. Of like, is like, it seems like that's what's missing, right? This thing is, we're going to have to create new tools and new ways of being, and to respond to these things. I question if we need to go and perform on the world stage. Are we doing our practice at home and honing our skills and honing ourselves, like in a way a martial artist would? Because then it makes me think of Bruce Lee and the whole idea of the style of no style, right? That we can use everything possible, but that to me, that's a big open hole to me, and I'm just wondering how people respond or think of that.
There's an,
Go ahead, Tom.
I think there's an interplay between skill building and sensitivity building. And when we design new processes and for skill building, we want to come from the right level of sensitivity. The malware does go all the way down perhaps, but I think what we can do is develop the sensitivity to know when we're operating from a level of higher complexity versus when we're releasing into a lower level of complexity for us. So rather than trying to always operate from this sort of some kind of purely empty space, that we can at least develop a sensitivity individually and collectively to know when we are operating from a space that's at least a little more released from the structures we normally operate from. And so if we develop that sensitivity, then we're moving in the right direction. We don't have to be perfect about the fact that, yes, there's malware there. And if we can do that, I think there's a better chance that the tools and practices that we develop will be pointing us in the right direction.
I kind of have a response to that, Tom, if I may. And this is kind of like when we talk about both directions, right? Top down, bottom up, ascending, descending. And a lot of times, like when I look at Dave Snowden's framework around Cynefin, and there's a part of me that kind of I choke on as a jazz musician and as a musician in general. A lot of times I'm embodying both the complex and the simple at the same time. It's non-dual in that way to me.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's as you said, there's that interaction, right? So in a way, it's, it leaves me wanting more when we say there's a duality there. Or am I mistaken there? But that's just kind of my response to that.
Yeah, it's a complex interaction between the two, and even just putting them as a duality is its own problem. But I think to become a better jazz player, you're kind of listening. There's just doing the jazz that you do, which is wonderful. But if you're wanting to become somehow a better, whatever that means, a jazz player, you're kind of listening to what is it that I'm holding on to now that I could let go of? What's at the edge? What's some structure that I might be using now that I could free to become play from an even larger space? So something about that, the sensitivity there. Yeah.
Steve?
I was going to respond to your kind of original thing. I love that you brought Bruce Lee in here. Bruce Lee's method of no method, he didn't start there. He started with method and lots of them. And it was only through doing that that he actually recognized and developed something that sort of transcended method in a certain way. And I think that is a good model for how this can work, how we can respond to the iatrogenic aspects of method, is recognizing all those limitations and eventually actually working in some kind of way where we open up into a kind of liberation from that. So yeah, I think it's just important to recognize that we don't start there. At least I don't know of a way to start there. Or you can attempt to start there, but like I said earlier, what that generally just reveals is that there's implicit method already in play, and that the attempt to liberate yourself from that from the very beginning doesn't really work.
I'm going to open up Alex's question, but we are at the end of our scheduled time. I'm going to hold this space open for people that want to stay. I'd just like to say thank you to all the speakers and all the participants of every kind of engagement. And let's see what Alex has to ask us. You have to unmute yourself, Alex.
Okay, got it. Thanks. Yeah, I just there's so much. This has been so valuable. But I just wanted to sort of speak to the knot that I am noticing untangling in listening to this conversation, this dialogue. And the thing that's untangling it isn't like the idea that I'll know enough at some point to have the answer that untangles the knot, but it's something more like recognizing that all of you who have chosen to speak and to be publicly known are bringing something like the edge of your knowledge, not the completion of it, but something like the edge of it. And that this humility, that we all have an edge of our knowledge, and that there is sort of this gap between where we are at the edge and then the completion of knowledge, and that gap is not what you all are trying to fill. And that is comforting, and also the definition of a teacher to me. And I've been studying with Bonnie quite a bit lately, and I just want to shout out to her that she has this, as a teacher, she has the quality I admire is that she has, of course, a brilliant intellect, as all of you do, more so than me by far. But it's this ability that she has, and that we all have as teachers in our own way, perhaps, to come back to whoever we are with and meet them at the edge of their knowledge, and to reassure that there is, that we're in this together, first of all, and that there's some word that was coming up, which was grace. And that perhaps the heuristic is not to bridge the gap of knowledge that can't be bridged, but the heuristic is something like, come to the edge of your knowledge, wherever that is, whether you're a dog or a fly or a human being, and open to receive not necessarily the wisdom of the teacher, but maybe the companionship or the camaraderie of the teacher, who is preparing you to receive, to let go, as Tom would say, to let go of what needs to be let go, or to receive what needs to be received. And so there feels like something like very alive for me about this idea of grace, or this experience of grace, and the heuristic that brings me to the edge of my knowledge, which is where grace then takes over. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Well said. Yeah.
I think the notion of staying at the edge is one of the meta principles of practice that allows it to be more like jazz.
I'm wanting to send a kind of blessing to Alex and ask all of us to send a blessing to all of us to support a kind of love and tolerance for just being at that edge. It's not easy, and it's wonderful.
I wonder if Taylor or Adriana has a question or something to say.
Was that for me?
You were one of the two I mentioned. How are you
Oh.
feeling about this?
I just it's like 3 a.m. here, so bear with me. I just really appreciate it. There's a lot of things that have been provoked by this conversation, and I think it's a perfect. I'm gonna speak later on today, but I was just feeling out of depth in some way. I was projecting on the way that the conference was going because I barely saw because I'm asleep, but I was projecting on what had been talked about. And so tapping into this one from my dreamland has been really profoundly grounding into the experience, I heard, I was hearing as I was changing, so I was hearing as I was, but the words were just sinking in deep. And there were so many things that I was making notes and I suppose it's just a very deep relaxation in things like we're here together, we're at the edge of our knowledge, we are just this notion of we're groping, we're trying to find out the gaps and in our understanding, and that feels really freeing. There's something about, I believe that to teach, I had bought into a thing that to be a teacher I had to look a certain way. So when Steve Marsh was saying about and it's really scary, it's really scary to share from the edge of your knowing, because at times I actually don't know how to answer, but there's a lot of baggage that I carry from saying I don't know, like it doesn't land very well, like in a lot of contexts. So I was just noticing how this conversation feels really it just moved a lot of things in me that made more space for more things that I still don't know what it is, but it just opened up. So I'm just extremely excited to have participated. Thank you.
How about you, Taylor? How you feeling about all this?
Oh. Can I just add something from Adriana? I just have this image of skydiving, like groups of people jumping out of an airplane, and exhilarating, terrifying, and looking around, and if you look around and you see that the others are smiling somehow, that they have a tolerance for this feeling of continual free fall, then you're in the right group.
Yeah, I'm just a lot of activation sort of in my chest, and feel a bit teary. There's something about the beauty, occurred to me. There's a beautiful dialectic and the gathering was happening, and I had a nice little fire going, and then Alex came in and dumped gasoline on it so we could all see it. And I can hear how Adriana's impacted, and I can certainly feel how I'm impacted. To me, this is the practice. This is, why I'm doing what I do, why I'm involved with Respond, why I work and do stuff with John, like this dialectic into Dialogus process, and what it gives us access to, that really real. Like, I just feel like that's here and much needed, even from somebody who watched a lot of the presentations yesterday. So just a lot of gratitude for not just the content, but how this conversation went about, how it turned into a dialectic, and what we're now with. So yeah, that's what I would say.
That's beautiful. And I want to say that if this was in some sense a performance, certainly my piece was provoked, is like a performance. It's made possible because of the kind of intimacy that I know I share with Steve, Tom, and Layman. And to me, all of this is only possible. It all hinges on intimacy. And that's something that we spent a lot of time at the Respond event, working with this problem and solution that is intimacy. So I would say that's the fundamental principle that we can rely on.
Yeah, it's like you've built up really good philia, as John would say. It's a strong philia that allows you to stay on that edge. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, Layman had me laying on the ground, dislocated both my shoulders so I couldn't get up. And then everybody watched and commented on the scene. So that's how you build intimacy.
A now legendary on the lawn wrestling match. I believe you described my body as being like a sack of trash.
Like a garbage bag of water, right? Because every time you can imagine that feeling, like if you're pushing against a really heavy garbage bag of water, it just like your arms just get lost and then it doesn't move. That's what my experience is like.
Any outstanding things for Tom or Steve? Anything still unsaid?
I just love where we've landed in this. You know, we need each other. We need each other to get through this. And maybe it's a lot less, as we've all been riffing on, about what we know or what we think we know. And it's more about really being at the edge of our unknowing together. So it is as a beautiful place to land in this conversation. So thanks to everyone for being here.